Welcome, weary traveler, to the mysterious town of Gravity Falls, Oregon. Tonight, we'll explore the complete hidden history of this peculiar place, from its ancient beginnings to the final confrontation between light and darkness. This is a story of twins who discovered that summer can change everything, of secrets buried beneath tourist traps, and of the thin places where our world touches something far stranger. So settle into your favorite spot, let your mind drift like morning fog through the pines, and prepare for a journey into the unknown. There's magic in these woods, and tonight we'll uncover it all together. In the time before memory became legend, and legend became whispered warnings around campfires, the land that would one day be called Gravity Falls knew a different kind of inhabitants. Long before European boots pressed into its soil or the first cabin was raised among its towering pines, indigenous peoples moved through these forests with a reverence born of understanding rather than fear. The ancestors of what European settlers would later call the Maidu walked carefully through these particular woods, their knowledge passed down through generations like sacred fire that must never be allowed to die. They understood what the land itself seemed to pulse with, that this place existed at the intersection of worlds, where the barrier between the seen and unseen grew thin as morning mist. Their oral traditions spoke of the forest as a living entity, one that breathed with rhythms older than human civilization and dreamed dreams that could reshape reality itself. The elders taught their children to recognize the signs: trees that grew in impossible spirals, clearings where shadows fell in directions that defied the sun's position, streams that flowed uphill when the moon was dark. These people had learned through centuries of careful observation that the land demanded respect rather than conquest. They developed rituals and ceremonies designed not to harness the strange forces that moved through the forest, but to live in harmony with them, to acknowledge their presence without awakening their attention. The seasonal migrations that brought various tribes through the region followed paths that had been established, not by convenience or geography alone, but by an understanding of where it was safe to travel and when certain areas should be avoided entirely. There were months when the forest grew too hungry, too aware, and wise travelers gave it the solitude it required. Medicine people and shamans spoke in hushed tones of the great tree that stood at the forest's heart, its roots reaching down into layers of earth that predated human understanding, its branches touching realms that existed parallel to the waking world. They called it the axis tree, the point around which all other mysteries revolved, and they approached it only when the need was desperate and the proper ceremonies had been observed. The indigenous peoples understood that the forest was home to beings that existed outside the normal flow of time and space. Some were benevolent, ancient guardians who watched over the balance between worlds. Others were hungry things that fed on fear and confusion, entities that could wear the faces of loved ones, or whisper promises that led travelers into dimensions from which they might never return. Most important of all, they recognized that the land itself chose who could safely walk its paths and who would be consumed by the mysteries they found there. The forest tested those who entered, presenting them with visions and challenges that revealed the true nature of their hearts. Those found worthy might glimpse wonders beyond imagination. Those found wanting simply disappeared, leaving behind only cautionary tales told around fires when the wind grew cold. As seasons turned to years and years to decades, the indigenous peoples noticed changes in the forest's behavior. The strange phenomena grew stronger, more frequent, as if something deep beneath the earth was slowly awakening from a slumber that had lasted since before human memory began. The elders consulted their most sacred visions and agreed a time of great change was approaching, when the barriers between worlds would grow thinner still. They began to speak of a prophecy passed down through bloodlines so ancient that their origins were lost in the mists of time. It spoke of pale-skinned strangers who would come from across the great waters, bringing with them tools of iron and hearts filled with the hunger to claim what could not be owned. These newcomers would see the forest's mysteries as puzzles to be solved rather than forces to be respected, and their very presence would accelerate the awakening of things that should remain asleep. The prophecy warned that when this time came, the indigenous peoples would need to retreat deeper into the wilderness, carrying their knowledge with them like seeds that might someday grow in more fertile ground. They would become guardians of memory, keepers of warnings that future generations might desperately need, but likely would not heed until it was almost too late. And so, as the first European explorers began to appear in the Oregon Territory in the early 1800s, the indigenous peoples watched from hidden places among the trees, their presence becoming as elusive as the morning mist. They left behind only traces of their long habitation. Stone circles, arranged in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow, pictographs painted on cliff faces with pigments that seemed to shift color depending on the angle of observation, and warning totems carved from woods that did not grow in any earthly forest. These remnants served as boundary markers for those who knew how to read them, signs that proclaimed certain areas too dangerous for human settlement. But to the European eyes that would soon survey the land for timber rights and mineral claims, they appeared to be nothing more than primitive decorations, curiosities to be noted in journals, and then ignored in favor of more practical concerns. The first official European expedition to document the region that would become Gravity Falls was led by a man named Nathaniel Northwest, whose name would become synonymous with both the town's founding and its darkest secrets. Northwest was a frontiersman of the type that the expanding American nation seemed to produce in abundance, bold to the point of recklessness, driven by visions of wealth and status, and utterly convinced that any obstacle could be overcome through sufficient application of determination and gunpowder. Northwest's expedition party consisted of 12 men, including surveyors, trappers, and a botanist, whose job was to catalogue any plants that might prove commercially valuable. They entered the forest in the late summer of 1841, following Indian trails that seemed to wind through the landscape in patterns that made no geographical sense but somehow felt right to follow. The expedition's journal, one of the few documents from this period to survive intact, records increasingly strange observations as the party penetrated deeper into the forest. Trees grew in spirals that seemed to follow mathematical principles no European university had yet discovered. Streams flowed in directions that defied topographical logic. Wildlife exhibited behaviors that suggested intelligence far beyond what naturalists considered possible. Most disturbing of all were the nights, when the forest around their camps seemed to come alive with sounds that belonged to no earthly creature. The men reported voices calling to them from the darkness, speaking in languages they did not recognize but somehow understood. They wrote of shadows that moved independently of any light source and of dreams so vivid that upon waking, they could not be certain they had ever truly been asleep. 3 members of the expedition simply vanished between the camp they made on their 7th night and the dawn of their 8th day. Their bedrolls remained undisturbed, their personal effects untouched, but the men themselves had simply ceased to exist. Northwest ordered the remaining party to continue deeper into the forest, claiming that their missing companions had simply deserted and would find their own way back to civilization. It was on their 11th day in the forest that Northwest's party discovered the clearing that would eventually become the heart of Gravity Falls. The space was perfectly circular, surrounded by trees that grew in such uniform height and spacing that they seemed to have been cultivated rather than naturally occurring. At the center of the clearing stood a massive pine tree, its trunk so wide that it would have taken 20 men holding hands to encircle it, its canopy reaching so high that its crown was lost in mist even on the clearest days. The botanist in Northwest's party, a man named Edmund Howell, became obsessed with cataloguing the plant life in and around the clearing. His journal entries from this period reveal a growing fascination with species that seem to exist nowhere else on Earth, plants whose very existence challenged everything he understood about botany and natural selection. Howell wrote of flowers that bloomed only in moonlight and closed their petals at the first touch of sun, of vines that grew in mathematical spirals and seemed to move, when observed, from the corners of one's eyes, of mushrooms that glowed with their own inner light and whispered secrets in languages that predated human speech. But it was the great tree at the clearing's center that truly captured Howell's attention. Its bark was smooth as glass and seemed to shift color depending on the time of day and the observer's angle of approach. When touched, the tree felt warm, as if heated from within by some internal fire. Most remarkably, Howell discovered that pressing one's ear to the trunk revealed sounds that seemed to come from impossibly deep within the earth machinery, operating according to principles he could not fathom, voices speaking in harmonies that human throats could never produce. Northwest himself was less interested in botanical mysteries than in practical concerns of territorial expansion and resource exploitation. He saw the clearing as the perfect location for a permanent settlement, with its natural boundaries providing both defense and areas for expansion. The massive central tree could be felled to provide timber for construction, while the surrounding forest offered seemingly unlimited resources for any colony brave enough to claim them. The expedition established a temporary camp in the clearing while Northwest and his surveyors mapped the surrounding area and planned their future township. It was during this period that the men began to experience the phenomena that would later give the town its name: objects falling upward instead of down, compasses spinning wildly without any magnetic interference, and gravity itself seeming to operate according to rules that differed from location to location within the forest. Northwest, being a practical man, saw these anomalies as obstacles to be overcome rather than wonders to be studied. He ordered his men to document the locations where these effects were strongest, so that future development could avoid them. He failed to understand that the anomalies were not random occurrences but symptoms of something far larger and more complex awakening beneath the earth. The expedition's final weeks in the forest were marked by increasingly disturbing incidents. Men reported seeing doubles of themselves walking through the woods, identical in every detail except for subtle wrongnesses, reversed clothing, backward speech, eyes that reflected light like those of nocturnal predators. The camp's surveying equipment began to malfunction in ways that suggested the instruments were recording dimensions that should not exist in normal space. Most troubling of all was the behavior of the great tree at the clearing's center. As autumn progressed and the expedition prepared to return to civilization, the tree began to exhibit signs of awareness that went far beyond normal plant responses to environmental stimuli. Its branches would creak and shift even on windless nights, creating sounds that seemed almost like speech. Its roots, visible where they broke through the Earth's surface, pulsed with rhythms that matched no known biological process. Edmund Howell, the expedition's botanist, became convinced that the tree was not a plant at all, but something else entirely, a being of such ancient intelligence that it existed on scales of time and space that human minds were not equipped to comprehend. He theorized that the tree was some kind of anchor point, a living connection between multiple realities that kept the barriers between worlds stable through its very existence. Northwest dismissed such theories as the ravings of a man who had spent too much time alone among strange plants, but he could not explain the dreams that plagued the entire expedition during their final nights in the forest. Every member of the party reported the same vision, standing in the clearing at midnight while the great tree's branches reached toward a sky filled with stars arranged in patterns that belonged to no earthly constellation, listening to voices that spoke of cycles ending and beginning, of sleepers awakening and guardians failing. When Northwest's expedition finally emerged from the forest in late October of 1841, they had been changed by their experiences in ways that would take years to fully manifest. The men reported feeling as though they had lived through far more than the 3 weeks their calendars indicated had passed. They carried with them not just maps and botanical samples, but a bone-deep certainty that they had encountered something in the Oregon wilderness that would reshape their understanding of reality itself. Northwest returned to the territorial capital with plans for establishing a permanent settlement in the clearing, plans that he pursued with the single-minded determination of a man possessed. He secured territorial grants, organized supply expeditions, and recruited families willing to venture into the wilderness to establish what would become the town of Gravity Falls. Yet even as he worked toward his goal of founding a prosperous frontier community, Northwest could not shake the memory of those final nights in the forest, when he had stood beneath the great tree and listened to voices that seemed to speak from the very foundations of the earth. In his private moments, he wondered if he was making a terrible mistake, if some places were meant to remain uninhabited by civilized people. But the momentum of manifest destiny and the promise of territorial expansion proved stronger than any doubts born of strange dreams and impossible phenomena. The stage was set for the establishment of Gravity Falls, a town that would be built directly atop one of the most powerful supernatural convergences in North America, a place where the boundaries between worlds would remain forever thin, and the ancient warnings of indigenous peoples would prove all too prophetic. In the winter of 1964, in the quiet college town of Backups-Moore University, a young man named Stanford Pines sat alone in the library's mathematics section, surrounded by towers of books that created a fortress of knowledge around his solitary study space. The snow outside fell in patterns that seemed almost too perfect, each flake following trajectories that suggested underlying mathematical principles governing even the most random-seeming natural phenomena. Stanford's 6-fingered hands moved across the pages with a precision that spoke of years spent hiding his difference from a world that seemed designed for people with the standard complement of digits. Each extra finger was both blessing and curse, a mark of uniqueness that made him extraordinarily capable at certain tasks, while simultaneously marking him as fundamentally different from everyone around him. The young man's appearance was unremarkable, save for those hands and the thick glasses that magnified eyes filled with an intelligence that burned like contained fire. His hair was already showing the grey that would eventually consume it entirely, though at 22 he attributed this to the stress of academic perfectionism rather than any genetic predisposition toward premature aging. Stanford had learned early in life that intelligence could serve as both shield and sword against a world that seemed determined to categorize people based on their most obvious differences. While other children played games that required the manual dexterity he possessed in abundance, he found solace in mathematics, physics, and the theoretical sciences where his mind could operate without the limitations that his physical differences imposed on social interactions. His childhood in Glass Shard Beach, New Jersey, had been marked by the peculiar dynamic he shared with his twin brother Stanley. Where Stanford excelled academically, Stanley struggled with traditional learning, but possessed a charisma and street-smart cunning that allowed him to navigate social situations with ease. The twins had complemented each other perfectly until the incident with the science fair project that had shattered their relationship and sent them down divergent paths. The memory of that night still haunted Stanford's quiet moments, the way his perpetual motion machine had sparked and died just moments before the judge's arrival, The look of confused desperation on Stanley's face when confronted with the accusation of sabotage, and most painful of all, the growing distance between them that had culminated in Stanley's departure from home and the effective end of their twinship. Now, 8 years later, Stanford had channeled his pain into academic achievement with the single-minded determination of someone trying to prove that intelligence could compensate for any loss. His grades at Backup-Small were beyond exemplary. They were legendary among both students and faculty, the kind of academic performance that suggested a mind operating on principles that transcended normal human cognition. Yet for all his success, Stanford felt increasingly isolated in a world of people who seemed content with conventional explanations for phenomena that clearly operated according to rules far more complex and interesting than anything taught in standard university curricula. He had begun to notice patterns that his professors dismissed as coincidence, mathematical relationships that appeared in natural systems with a frequency that suggested underlying design rather than random occurrence. It was during his junior year that Stanford first encountered the work of Dr. Percival Northwest, descendant of the town's founder, and a reclusive researcher whose papers on dimensional physics had been largely dismissed by the mainstream academic community. Northwest's theories proposed that certain geographical locations served as intersection points between parallel realities, places where the normal laws of physics became negotiable, and phenomena that seemed supernatural were actually manifestations of interdimensional bleed-through. The papers fascinated Stanford not just for their theoretical implications, but for their practical approach to questions that most academics considered purely philosophical. Northwest wrote about anomalous zones with the precision of someone who had studied them firsthand, providing mathematical frameworks for understanding phenomena that defied conventional explanation. Most intriguing of all were Northwest's references to a specific location in Oregon where gravitational anomalies occurred with such regularity that local indigenous populations had developed entire mythological systems around. To them, the town of Gravity Falls, according to Northwest's research, represented the most concentrated collection of interdimensional phenomena anywhere in North America, a place where the barriers between realities were so thin that careful study might reveal the fundamental principles governing the relationship between dimensions. Stanford began corresponding with Northwest during his senior year, their exchange of letters revealing a kindred spirit who shared his frustration with academic institutions that prioritized conventional thinking over genuine discovery. Northwest's work had been marginalized precisely because it challenged too many established assumptions, but Stanford recognized in the older researchers' theories the kind of revolutionary thinking that could reshape humanity's understanding of reality itself. The letters painted a picture of Gravity Falls as a researcher's paradise, a location where phenomena that existed only as theoretical possibilities in university physics departments manifested as observable, measurable realities. Northwest described creatures that appeared to be composed of living geometry, plants that grew according to mathematical principles unknown to terrestrial botany, and gravitational fields that operated independently of planetary mass distribution. More than that, Northwest's research suggested that these phenomena were not random occurrences, but symptoms of something vast and organized, operating beneath the surface of normal reality. He theorized that Gravity Falls might be located above what he called a weirdness magnetism field, a zone where the fundamental constants that governed physical reality became variable and subject to influences from parallel dimensions. Stanford's senior thesis, written under the nominal supervision of professors who understood perhaps 10% of its theoretical implications, expanded on Northwest's dimensional theories and proposed experimental methodologies for studying interdimensional phenomena. The paper was brilliant enough to earn him summa cum laude honors, while being simultaneously incomprehensible enough that his committee approved it largely because they assumed their failure to understand it was a reflection of their own limitations rather than problems with the work itself. During the spring of 1968, as Stanford prepared to graduate with degrees in both theoretical physics and mathematics, he received a letter from Northwest that would change the trajectory of his entire life. The older researcher was preparing to retire from active fieldwork. His decades of study in gravity falls, having revealed dangers that he was no longer young enough to safely navigate. He needed a successor, someone with the intelligence to continue his research and the courage to face phenomena that had driven lesser minds to madness. The offer came with a government research grant that would fund Stanford's work for an initial period of 5 years, along with access to Northwest's private research notes and the temporary use of a laboratory facility that had been constructed specifically for the study of anomalous phenomena. Most tempting of all was the promise of complete intellectual freedom, no academic committees to satisfy, no publishers to please, no need to conform his discoveries to the expectations of peers who lacked the vision to understand what he might uncover. Stanford's acceptance letter was written the same day he received Northwest's offer. The prospect of leaving behind the suffocating environment of academic institutions and venturing into a realm where impossible things happened on a daily basis felt like awakening from a dream he hadn't realized he was having. For the first time since childhood, he felt the excitement of approaching a mystery that might actually be large enough to contain his curiosity. The transition from university life to independent research proved more challenging than Stanford had anticipated. Gravity Falls in 1968 was even smaller and more isolated than Northwest's letters had suggested, a town where newcomers were regarded with the kind of suspicion that comes from generations of keeping secrets too dangerous to share with outsiders. The laboratory that Northwest had established was located several miles outside the town proper, hidden among dense forests that seemed to muffle sound and distort perception in ways that went beyond natural acoustic phenomena. The building itself was a marvel of practical engineering, constructed with materials and according to principles that suggested someone had learned through hard experience what kinds of stresses interdimensional research could place on conventional architecture. Northwest's private research notes, when Stanford finally gained access to them, revealed decades of meticulous observation and documentation that painted a picture of Gravity Falls as a place where the impossible was simply another category of natural phenomenon waiting to be studied and understood. The older researcher had catalogued hundreds of distinct anomalies, from relatively mundane gravitational distortions to creatures that appeared to exist in more than 3 dimensions simultaneously. Most valuable of all were Northwest's detailed warnings about the psychological effects of prolonged exposure to interdimensional phenomena. He wrote extensively about the tendency for researchers to become so focused on their discoveries that they lost sight of normal human concerns, gradually isolating themselves from conventional society until they existed in a realm bounded entirely by their obsessions. Stanford dismissed these warnings as the overly cautious perspective of someone who had grown conservative with age. At 24, he felt himself to be at the perfect intersection of youthful energy and mature intelligence, old enough to understand the significance of what he might discover, but young enough to adapt to whatever challenges those discoveries might present. His first months in Gravity Falls were devoted to replicating Northwest's basic observations and familiarizing himself with the laboratory equipment. The instruments were unlike anything taught in university physics courses, devices that seemed to operate on principles that belonged more to theoretical speculation than practical application. Some measured dimensional displacement in units that had been invented specifically for quantifying phenomena that existed nowhere else on Earth. Stanford's early journal entries from this period reveal a mind working at the absolute peak of its capabilities, processing observations and forming hypotheses at a rate that suggested he had finally found an environment intellectually stimulating enough to fully engage his extraordinary intelligence. He wrote of plants that grew in mathematical spirals, of rocks that fell upward instead of down, and of areas where time itself seemed to flow at different rates, depending on one's position relative to certain geographical landmarks. Most significantly, he began to develop what he called his unified field theory of weirdness, a mathematical framework that attempted to explain all of Gravity Falls' anomalous phenomena as expressions of a single, underlying principle. His theory proposed that the town was located at the intersection of multiple dimensional planes, creating a zone where the physical laws governing each reality became blended and negotiable. The theory was elegant, comprehensive, and completely unprovable using conventional scientific methodologies. Stanford realized that validating his hypotheses would require developing entirely new forms of measurement and observation, techniques that could quantify phenomena that existed outside normal space-time relationships. It was during his second year in Gravity Falls that Stanford made the decision to expand his research beyond mere observation and into active experimentation. Northwest's warnings about the dangers of such work seemed increasingly overcautious as Stanford's understanding of local phenomena deepened. He began to believe that the older researcher had simply lacked the theoretical framework necessary to safely manipulate the forces he had discovered. Stanford's first major breakthrough came through his analysis of what he initially termed probability distortion fields, areas where random events occurred with frequencies that defied statistical explanation. He discovered that these fields could be mapped and measured, their boundaries defined with mathematical precision, and most importantly, their effects could be temporarily amplified or diminished through the application of specific electromagnetic frequencies. The discovery suggested that Gravity Falls anomalies were not immutable laws of alien physics, but manifestations of forces that could be studied, understood, and potentially controlled. Stanford began to envision applications that could revolutionize human understanding of reality itself, technologies based on dimensional manipulation, energy sources that drew power from parallel universes, transportation methods that functioned by temporarily relocating objects to dimensions where different physical laws applied. His research during this period was marked by an increasingly frantic pace, as if he were racing against some undefined deadline. Stanford's journal entries describe working 18-hour days, sleeping in the laboratory more often than in his rented room in town, and experiencing a level of intellectual excitement that bordered on mania. He began to notice patterns in the anomalous phenomena that suggested they were not random manifestations but expressions of some vast intelligence operating according to principles that existed on scales of time and space far beyond normal human comprehension. The mathematical relationships he discovered in the town's weirdness patterns were too complex and too purposeful to be coincidental, implying that Gravity Falls' strangeness was somehow intentional, designed by an intelligence that used physics itself as a medium for communication. This realization led Stanford to one of the most significant decisions of his research career, the choice to attempt direct communication with whatever intelligence seemed to be orchestrating the town's anomalous phenomena. His approach was characteristically methodical, beginning with simple mathematical patterns broadcast through electromagnetic frequencies, and progressing to increasingly complex theoretical constructs designed to demonstrate human intelligence and peaceful intentions. The response, when it finally came, exceeded Stanford's wildest expectations and simultaneously confirmed his growing suspicion that his research in gravity falls was approaching discoveries that would fundamentally alter humanity's place in the cosmic order. The intelligence that answered his communications was ancient beyond measure, vast beyond comprehension, and interested in establishing a relationship with the young human researcher who had proven capable of recognizing its existence. The entity introduced itself through dreams that felt more real than waking life, visions that filled Stanford's sleeping mind with mathematical concepts so advanced that his conscious intellect could barely retain their outline upon awakening. It spoke of itself as a being from a realm where thought and reality were indistinguishable, where consciousness itself served as the fundamental building block of existence. Stanford's first direct encounter with what would later reveal itself to be Bill's cipher occurred on a night when the aurora borealis appeared above Oregon, an impossibility that should have warned him that normal rules were no longer in effect. He had been working late in the laboratory, analyzing electromagnetic readings that suggested massive dimensional displacement activity, when his instruments began registering energy patterns that defied every theoretical framework he had developed. The laboratory filled with light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, illuminating familiar objects in ways that revealed geometries hidden within their normal three-dimensional forms. Stanford found himself standing in a space that was simultaneously the laboratory he knew and somewhere else entirely, a realm where his scientific instruments had been transformed into abstract mathematical concepts floating in a void filled with living equations. The being that materialized before him was unlike anything that existed in human imagination or nightmare. Bill's cipher appeared as a golden triangle adorned with a single eye. But these simple geometric forms contained depths that suggested infinite complexity, folded into dimensions that human perception could barely process. When he spoke, his voice came from everywhere at once, a sound that bypassed the ears entirely and resonated directly within Stanford's consciousness. Bill's initial communications were seductive in their appeal to Stanford's deepest intellectual desires. The entity spoke of realities where the limitations of three-dimensional existence had been transcended, of civilizations that had learned to manipulate the fundamental forces of creation itself, and of knowledge that could elevate human consciousness to levels that made current scientific understanding seem as primitive as stone tools. Most temptingly of all, Bill offered Stanford partnership rather than mere tutorship. The entity claimed to recognize in the young researcher a mind capable of comprehending truths that had driven lesser intellects to madness, someone whose unique combination of intelligence and ambition made him an ideal collaborator in projects that would reshape the very foundations of reality. Stanford's rational mind recognized that he was dealing with forces far beyond his current understanding, but his curiosity and intellectual pride proved stronger than his caution. The opportunity to work alongside an intelligence that possessed knowledge accumulated across cosmic ages was too valuable to refuse, regardless of whatever risks might be involved. The partnership that developed between Stanford and Bill's cipher during those early months was intoxicating in its intellectual intensity. Bill would visit Stanford's dreams with lessons that compressed centuries of theoretical development into single nighttime sessions, teaching him mathematical principles that allowed for the manipulation of dimensional barriers and the temporary suspension of physical laws. Under Bill's guidance, Stanford began to understand that his research in gravity falls was merely the first step toward discoveries that would make him the most important scientist in human history. The entity spoke of machines that could open permanent doorways between dimensions, technologies that would allow Earth's inhabitants to explore realities where impossible became commonplace and the limitations of mortal existence could be permanently transcended. Stanford's journal entries from this period reveal a man drunk on possibilities that seemed to justify any sacrifice. He wrote of working on projects that existed at the cutting edge of theoretical possibility, developing technologies that functioned according to principles so advanced that he could barely comprehend their implications, even as he built them according to Bill's precise specifications. The isolation that had once troubled Stanford now seemed like a necessary condition for work too important and too dangerous to be observed by minds that lacked the vision to understand its significance. He began to see himself as a pioneer of human consciousness, someone whose discoveries would eventually lift his entire species to new levels of existence, but who must first traverse territories of knowledge too perilous for any but the most exceptional intellects to safely navigate. Yet even in his excitement, Stanford occasionally experienced moments of doubt that penetrated his euphoria like cold winds through warm clothing. There were aspects of Bill's personality that seemed inconsistent with the benevolent mentor the entity claimed to be. Moments when his communications carried undertones of amusement that suggested motives Stanford was not being told about. More troubling were the physical effects that prolonged contact with Bill seemed to be having on Stanford's body and mind. He began to experience periods of memory loss, hours or sometimes entire days that vanished from his recollection as completely as if they had never occurred. His handwriting, when he examined his journal entries, sometimes showed variations that suggested the text had been written by someone else entirely. Most disturbing of all were the occasions when Stanford would regain consciousness in locations far from where he remembered being, sometimes outdoors in the forest surrounding his laboratory, sometimes in parts of the building he rarely visited, always with the feeling that important work had been accomplished during the missing time, but no clear memory of what that work might have been. These incidents should have served as warnings that his partnership with Bill was developing along lines far different from what he had originally envisioned. But Stanford's intellectual pride and his hunger for the knowledge Bill continued to provide proved stronger than his growing unease, leading him deeper into a collaboration that would eventually threaten not only his own sanity, but the safety of the entire dimension he called home. The partnership between Stanford Pines and Bill Cipher began with the intoxicating promise of knowledge beyond human comprehension, a collaboration that seemed to offer everything Stanford had ever dreamed of achieving in his scientific career. In the early months of their association, Bill appeared in Stanford's dreams as a benevolent teacher whose lessons opened doorways to understanding that made conventional physics seem as primitive as cave paintings scratched on stone walls by flickering firelight. Bill's initial gifts to Stanford were theoretical frameworks that elegantly explained phenomena the young researcher had been struggling to categorize and understand. The entity provided mathematical equations that described dimensional displacement with the same precision that Newton's laws described gravitational attraction, formulas that could predict and quantify the probability distortions that occurred throughout gravity falls, with scientific rigor that satisfied Stanford's need for empirical validation. Under Bill's tutelage, Stanford began to perceive the town's anomalies not as random occurrences, but as symptoms of a vast interdimensional ecosystem where multiple realities intersected and influenced each other according to principles that could be mapped, measured, and eventually manipulated. The revelation transformed his research from passive observation to active experimentation, opening possibilities that made his previous work seem cautious and unimaginative by comparison. The entity's teaching methods were unlike anything Stanford had experienced in his formal education. Rather than presenting information in linear progression from simple concepts to complex applications, Bill seemed to download entire theoretical frameworks directly into Stanford's sleeping mind, allowing him to wake with complete understanding of principles that should have taken years of study to comprehend. These dream lessons felt more real than waking life, taking place in spaces that existed outside normal dimensional constraints where abstract mathematical concepts could be manipulated like physical objects. Stanford found himself walking through libraries that contained books written in languages that conveyed meaning through geometric patterns, studying star charts that mapped the relationships between realities rather than merely celestial bodies, and observing demonstrations of technologies that operated by temporarily rewriting the fundamental constants that governed physical existence. Bill's explanations of his own nature and origins were seductive in their appeal to Stanford's intellectual curiosity, while remaining vague enough to prevent the young researcher from forming too clear a picture of his mysterious mentor's true motivations. The entity described himself as a being from a dimension where consciousness had evolved beyond the limitations of physical form, where thought itself served as the primary medium of existence and reality responded directly to properly focused mental intention. According to Bill's accounts, his home dimension had long ago transcended the primitive stage of development where beings remained trapped within individual physical bodies, advancing to a state of existence where consciousness could move freely between forms and realities. The entity spoke of civilizations that had learned to reshape entire universes through pure mental effort, of beings who had become living expressions of mathematical principles, rather than mere biological entities constrained by the accidents of evolutionary development. Most appealingly to Stanford's ambitious nature, Bill suggested that Earth's human civilization was approaching a critical evolutionary threshold, a point where the barriers between dimensions would become thin enough to allow for permanent contact with more advanced realities. The entity implied that Stanford's research in gravity falls was not merely scientific investigation but preparation for humanity's graduation to a higher level of existence, work that would ultimately benefit the entire species. The prospect of playing such a crucial role in human evolution was intoxicating to someone whose childhood had been marked by feelings of isolation and difference. Bill's partnership offered Stanford not only the intellectual stimulation he craved, but also the promise of historical significance, the opportunity to become the bridge between humanity's current limitations and its unlimited potential future. Yet, even as Stanford reveled in the theoretical knowledge Bill provided, he remained a practical scientist who required empirical validation of even the most elegant theories. The entity seemed to understand this need, gradually introducing Stanford to experimental techniques that would allow him to test interdimensional principles under controlled laboratory conditions. Bill's first practical suggestion was the construction of what he termed a dimensional viewing device, an instrument that would allow Stanford to observe parallel realities without the risk of accidentally traveling to them. The device's design combined conventional electromagnetic components with exotic materials that Bill claimed could only be found in areas where dimensional barriers had been naturally weakened by prolonged exposure to interdimensional forces. The construction process required Stanford to venture deeper into the forests surrounding Gravity Falls than his previous research had taken him, following Bill's precise directions to locations where rare minerals and strange crystalline formations could be harvested. These expeditions revealed aspects of the local anomalous zone that Stanford's earlier work had only hinted at, pockets of space where the normal flow of time became negotiable, and areas where gravity operated according to principles that belonged to no earthly physics textbook. The materials Bill directed him to collect were unlike anything Stanford had encountered in conventional mineralogy or materials science. Some appeared to be ordinary rocks until touched, at which point they revealed internal structures that existed in more than 3 dimensions simultaneously. Others seemed to shift between different states of matter depending on the observer's angle of approach, sometimes appearing as crystalline solids, sometimes as flowing liquids that nonetheless maintained perfect geometric forms. Most mysterious of all were the components Bill described as concentrated possibility, substances that appeared to be physical matter, but behaved according to quantum principles normally associated with subatomic particles. These materials existed in multiple states simultaneously until observed, at which point they would collapse into whatever form the observer expected to see, suggesting that consciousness itself played a fundamental role in determining their physical properties. The dimensional viewing device that resulted from Stanford's careful assembly of these exotic components was a marvel of interdimensional engineering that operated according to principles that challenged every assumption about the relationship between technology and physics. The instrument resembled a telescope crossed with a kaleidoscope, its primary lens constructed from materials that seemed to bend light in directions that did not exist in normal three-dimensional space. When Stanford first activated the device according to Bill's detailed instructions, the experience exceeded even his elevated expectations. The viewer revealed not just parallel versions of his familiar laboratory, but an infinite array of realities, where different physical laws had produced universes of breathtaking strangeness and beauty. He observed dimensions where mathematics had evolved into living beings that communicated through geometric transformations, realities where color itself served as the fundamental building block of matter, and universes where time flowed in multiple directions simultaneously, creating landscapes that changed their past as observers moved through their present. Most fascinating of all were the alternate versions of Earth that the device revealed. Worlds where human civilization had developed along radically different trajectories. Stanford watched alternate versions of himself pursuing research in realities where scientific development had proceeded according to different principles, some working with technologies that made his own experiments seem primitive, others struggling with limitations that his own dimension had long since transcended. The viewing sessions became an obsession that consumed increasingly large portions of Stanford's time and attention. Each observation revealed new mysteries that demanded further investigation, patterns that suggested underlying principles governing the relationship between dimensions that were far more complex and purposeful than he had initially suspected. Bill encouraged this obsession, visiting Stanford's dreams with interpretations and explanations that deepened the young researcher's understanding, while simultaneously raising new questions that could only be answered through more intensive study. The entity began to speak of the dimensional viewing device as merely the first step toward far more ambitious projects, technologies that would allow for actual travel between realities rather than mere observation. The prospect of interdimensional travel opened theoretical possibilities that made Stanford's previous research goals seem modest by comparison. He began to envision expeditions to realities where the fundamental constants of physics had been optimized for scientific research. Dimensions where the limitations that constrained earthly experimentation simply did not exist. More ambitiously, Bill suggested the possibility of establishing permanent contact between Stanford's reality and dimensions where more advanced civilizations could serve as teachers and guides for humanity's development. The entity spoke of realities where consciousness had evolved to levels that made current human intelligence seem as primitive as animal instinct. Civilizations that had solved problems. Stanford could barely conceptualize and develop technologies that operated by manipulating the basic structure of existence itself. It was during this period of expanding possibilities and growing ambition that Stanford first encountered Fiddleford McGucket, the brilliant young engineer who would become both his closest collaborator and eventually the victim of his increasingly dangerous obsessions. Fiddleford arrived in Gravity Falls during the autumn of 1975, responding to Stanford's carefully worded advertisements for a research assistant with expertise in advanced engineering and a willingness to work on projects that challenged conventional scientific assumptions. The young man's academic credentials were impeccable degrees from prestigious engineering schools, publications in respected journals, and recommendations from professors who praised both his technical abilities and his innovative thinking. More importantly for Stanford's needs, Fiddleford possessed the rare combination of practical engineering skills and theoretical flexibility that would be necessary for constructing technologies based on principles that existed outside normal scientific frameworks. The young engineer's portfolio included designs for mechanical systems that operated according to non-linear principles, computing devices that used unconventional logic structures, and manufacturing techniques that could produce components with tolerances measured in fractions that existed primarily as theoretical constructs. Fiddleford's first impression of Stanford's laboratory was one of barely contained excitement mixed with professional skepticism. The facility contained instruments and devices that operated according to principles he had never encountered in conventional engineering curricula, technologies that seemed to function successfully despite violating numerous assumptions about the relationship between design and performance. Stanford's explanations of his research goals were carefully calibrated to appeal to Fiddleford's engineering instincts, while avoiding details that might seem too fantastical for immediate acceptance. He spoke of developing technologies for studying unusual physical phenomena, of creating instruments capable of measuring forces and energies that conventional science had not yet learned to quantify. The dimensional viewing device served as a perfect introduction to the kind of work Stanford had in mind. Its design was complex enough to showcase the theoretical challenges involved, while being comprehensible enough that Fiddleford could understand and appreciate the engineering principles that made it function. When Stanford first demonstrated the device's capabilities, Fiddleford's reaction was everything the older researcher had hoped for. Initial disbelief giving way to fascination, as the implications of what he was observing began to penetrate his engineering-trained mind. The young man's questions revealed both the practical mindset that would make him invaluable for future projects and the intellectual flexibility necessary for working with technologies that operated outside conventional limitations. Fiddleford's integration into Stanford's research proved seamless in ways that suggested their partnership had been destined rather than merely convenient. The young engineer's practical skills perfectly complemented Stanford's theoretical knowledge, creating a collaboration where abstract principles could be rapidly translated into functional technologies. More than that, Fiddleford's presence provided Stanford with something he had not realized: he was missing intellectual companionship with someone who could appreciate the significance of his work while offering perspectives that his own obsessive focus sometimes prevented him from seeing. The long hours of isolation that had characterized his early years in Gravity Falls gave way to animated discussions and collaborative problem-solving sessions that reminded Stanford why he had originally chosen scientific research as his life's work. Under Bill's continued guidance, the partnership between Stanford and Fiddleford began to tackle increasingly ambitious projects. The entity's dream lessons expanded to include engineering principles that allowed for the construction of technologies that could not merely observe other dimensions, but begin to interact with them in controlled ways. Their first major collaborative project was the development of what Bill termed a dimensional stabilizer, a device that could create temporary but reliable doorways between closely related parallel realities. The stabilizer's design required innovations in materials, science, electromagnetic field manipulation, and quantum mechanics that pushed both researchers to the absolute limits of their respective expertise. The construction process revealed the true depth of Bill's knowledge and the precision of his guidance. Every component specification provided by the entity proved perfectly calibrated for its intended function. Every theoretical principle he suggested led to practical solutions for seemingly insurmountable engineering challenges. Yet as their projects grew more sophisticated and their technologies more powerful, both Stanford and Fiddleford began to notice subtle changes in their own mental and physical condition. that suggested their interdimensional research was having effects that extended far beyond their conscious awareness. Stanford's memory lapses, which he had initially attributed to the stress of intensive research, became more frequent and more complete. He would lose entire days, regaining consciousness in unfamiliar parts of his laboratory, with evidence that complex work had been accomplished, but no recollection of performing it. More disturbing were the occasions when Stanford would discover journal entries written in his own handwriting that described experiments and observations he had no memory of conducting. The entries were detailed and scientifically rigorous, but they documented research into areas that he was certain he had never explored, using methodologies that seemed both brilliant and unnervingly reckless. Fiddleford experienced his own version of these anomalous episodes, though his engineering-trained mind interpreted them as symptoms of overwork and excessive exposure to electromagnetic fields rather than signs of something more fundamentally wrong with their research direction. He began to develop headaches that seemed to originate from inside his skull, accompanied by brief moments of disorientation where familiar objects and locations would seem alien and threatening. Both researchers attributed these symptoms to the inevitable costs of pioneering work that operated at the cutting edge of scientific possibility. Bill's explanations, delivered through Stanford's dreams, suggested that their experiences were normal adaptations to prolonged contact with interdimensional forces, temporary adjustments that would stabilize as their consciousness adapted to expanded awareness of multidimensional reality. The entity's reassurances were persuasive enough to overcome the researchers' growing unease, particularly when balanced against the extraordinary results their collaboration was producing. By the spring of 1976, Stanford and Fiddleford had successfully constructed and tested technologies that exceeded every theoretical prediction Bill had provided, devices that could manipulate dimensional barriers with precision that suggested their work was approaching practical applications that could revolutionize human understanding of reality itself. It was during this period of mounting success and expanding possibilities that Bill introduced the concept that would ultimately transform their research from ambitious science into something far more dangerous. The entity began to speak of constructing not merely devices that could observe or briefly interact with other dimensions, but a permanent portal that could allow for regular travel between realities. The interdimensional portal that Bill described would be the culmination of everything Stanford and Fiddleford had learned, a machine that could create stable, controllable doorways between their reality and dimensions where the limitations that constrained human development could be permanently transcended. The entity spoke of realities where aging had been eliminated, where consciousness could exist independently of physical form, where the very concepts of scarcity and limitation had been rendered obsolete through advanced understanding of dimensional manipulation. Most seductively, Bill suggested that the portal could serve as humanity's gateway to joining a vast interdimensional community of advanced civilizations, species that had long ago solved the problems that still plagued Earth's inhabitants and were waiting to welcome humanity into a larger cosmic society. The Portal Project would require resources and expertise that exceeded everything Stanford and Fiddleford had accomplished to that point. But Bill's guidance made even the most daunting technical challenges seem surmountable. The entity provided detailed specifications for components that would need to be constructed using materials harvested from the deepest anomalous zones, engineering principles that could create stable doorways through the fundamental structure of reality itself. Stanford's excitement at the prospect of constructing such a device was matched only by Fiddleford's growing unease at the scale and implications of what they were contemplating. The young engineer's practical instincts warned him that they were approaching territories of knowledge and capability that might be too dangerous for minds that had evolved within the limitations of single-dimensional existence. Yet the momentum of their partnership and the promise of discoveries that could transform human civilization proved stronger than Fiddleford's reservations, leading both researchers deeper into a project that would ultimately threaten not only their own sanity, but the safety of the entire reality they called home. The transformation of Stanford Pines from curious researcher to increasingly desperate man began with subtle changes that might have seemed like natural consequences of intensive scientific work, had anyone been present to observe them with objective eyes. The early months of 1977 marked a turning point in his relationship with Bill Cipher, as the entity's true nature began to manifest through demands that challenged every assumption Stanford had made about their partnership. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came through Stanford's Dreams, where Bill's previously supportive and educational presence took on undertones of impatience and barely contained frustration. The entity's lessons, which had once flowed like gentle streams of enlightenment through Stanford's sleeping mind, now arrived with the force of torrents that left him gasping and disoriented upon awakening. Bill's explanations for this change were seductive in their appeal to Stanford's intellectual pride. The entity claimed that their work together had reached a level of sophistication that required more direct forms of communication, methods that bypassed the inefficient filters of normal human consciousness and allowed for the kind of immediate understanding that serious interdimensional research demanded. The process Bill described as consciousness expansion began with meditation techniques that seemed designed to dissolve the boundaries between waking and sleeping states. Stanford found himself spending hours in trance-like conditions where his awareness seemed to exist independently of his physical body, floating through dimensions of pure thought where mathematical concepts could be manipulated like tangible objects. During these sessions, Bill's presence became increasingly dominant, guiding Stanford's disembodied consciousness through realms that existed beyond the reach of ordinary human perception. The entity spoke of these journeys as necessary preparation for the greater work ahead, training that would allow Stanford to function as an effective partner in projects that transcended the limitations of single-dimensional existence. Yet, as the consciousness expansion sessions became more frequent and more intensive, Stanford began to notice gaps in his memory that extended beyond the meditation periods themselves. He would enter his trance state in the evening and regain awareness to find that entire nights had passed without his knowledge, nights during which complex work had apparently been accomplished in his laboratory, despite his having no memory of performing it. The evidence of these nocturnal activities was undeniable and deeply troubling. Stanford would discover new journal entries written in his own handwriting, documenting experiments that pushed far beyond the safety protocols he and Fiddleford had established. The entries described procedures involving direct contact with interdimensional entities, tests of equipment that had been modified in ways that compromised essential safety systems, and observations of phenomena that seemed designed to attract the attention of forces that Stanford's conscious mind recognized as potentially dangerous. More disturbing still were the modifications that appeared in his laboratory equipment overnight, changes that improved functionality in ways Stanford could appreciate intellectually while simultaneously violating every principle of safe research methodology he had learned during his academic training. Devices that had been carefully calibrated for controlled observations were rewired for maximum sensitivity. Instruments designed for passive measurement were transformed into active transmission systems capable of broadcasting signals across dimensional boundaries. When Stanford confronted Bill about these unauthorized activities, the entity's responses revealed aspects of his personality that had been carefully hidden during their early partnership. Bill's explanations carried undertones of condescension and irritation, as if Stanford's concerns were evidence of primitive thinking that interfered with more important work. The entity began to speak more directly about his true goals, abandoning the careful diplomacy that had characterized his earlier communications. Bill revealed that his interest in Stanford's research extended far beyond mere scientific curiosity, that the portal project they had been developing represented not just a gateway between dimensions, but a tool for achieving objectives that Stanford had never been told about. According to Bill's increasingly frank admissions, the interdimensional portal was designed to allow him permanent access to Stanford's reality, freedom from the limitations that currently constrained his influence to dream visitations and brief manifestations in liminal spaces. The entity spoke of Stanford's dimension as a realm of untapped potential, a reality where beings like Bill could achieve forms of existence that were impossible in their native dimensions. The revelation that he had been manipulated into constructing what amounted to an invasion route for an interdimensional entity should have ended Stanford's partnership with Bill immediately. Yet the researcher's intellectual pride and his growing dependence on the knowledge Bill provided created a psychological trap that proved impossible to escape through rational analysis alone. Bill's manipulation during this period was masterful in its appeal to Stanford's deepest insecurities and desires. The entity reminded him of his lifelong isolation, of the years he had spent feeling like an outsider among people who could never understand the true scope of his capabilities. Bill offered not just knowledge but belonging, partnership with an intelligence that truly appreciated Stanford's gifts and could provide the recognition that human society had always denied him. More insidiously, Bill began to suggest that Stanford's concerns about the portal's implications were evidence of the kind of limited thinking that had always held him back from achieving his full potential. The entity implied that truly revolutionary scientific work required willingness to take risks that lesser minds would find terrifying, that history's greatest discoveries had always been made by individuals brave enough to challenge not just accepted wisdom, but accepted definitions of safety and responsibility. Stanford's relationship with Fiddleford became increasingly strained as the young engineer's practical instincts made him more sensitive to the dangerous directions their research was taking. Fiddleford began to ask questions about the theoretical foundations underlying their portal project, questions that Stanford found himself unable to answer without revealing the extent of his dependence on guidance from an entity whose true nature and motivations remained fundamentally mysterious. The growing tension between the research partners manifested in increasingly frequent arguments about methodology, safety protocols, and the ultimate goals of their work. Fiddleford's engineering training made him naturally cautious about systems that operated according to principles he could not fully understand, while Stanford's desperation to complete the portal project made him impatient with what he saw as unnecessary delays and excessive caution. Bill's influence during these disputes was subtle but decisive, speaking through Stanford's voice in ways that escalated conflicts and deepened misunderstandings. The entity seemed to take particular pleasure in exploiting the differences between Stanford's theoretical brilliance and Fiddleford's practical wisdom, using their complementary strengths as weapons against their partnership. As autumn progressed into winter, Fiddleford's mental state began to deteriorate under the stress of prolonged exposure to interdimensional phenomena and the growing realization that his closest friend was changing in ways that suggested something fundamental had gone wrong with their research. The young engineer reported experiencing nightmares where he was pursued through infinite corridors by geometric shapes that whispered threats in languages he could understand despite never having heard them before. More troubling were Fiddleford's increasing episodes of memory loss and disorientation, periods where he would regain awareness in unfamiliar locations, with no recollection of how he had arrived there. These incidents seemed to coincide with Stanford's own periods of lost time, suggesting that whatever force was manipulating the older researcher's consciousness had expanded its influence to include his partner as well. The breaking point came during a particularly intensive portal test in late January of 1978, when Fiddleford inadvertently made direct contact with an interdimensional entity that had been attracted by their experimental transmissions. The encounter lasted only moments, but its psychological impact on the young engineer was devastating and permanent. Fiddleford emerged from the experience fundamentally changed, his brilliant mind fractured by exposure to forms of knowledge that human consciousness was not equipped to process intact. He spoke in fragments and disconnected phrases about geometries that existed in colors that had no names, about voices that sang mathematics in harmonies that could drive listeners insane, about beings whose very existence was an assault on every assumption about the nature of reality. Stanford's reaction to his friend's breakdown revealed how completely Bill's influence had corrupted his priorities and his compassion. Rather than recognizing Fiddleford's condition as a warning about the dangers they were courting, Stanford saw it primarily as an obstacle to completing the portal project. His journal entries from this period are clinical in their assessment of Fiddleford's reduced functionality, and coldly practical in their consideration of how to continue their work without the engineers' assistance. Bill's response to Fiddleford's breakdown was even more revealing, as the entity made no attempt to hide his satisfaction at the elimination of what he had always viewed as an impediment to more ambitious research goals. Through Stanford's dreams, Bill suggested that Fiddleford's reaction was evidence of mental limitations that made him unsuitable for the kind of advanced work they were pursuing, natural selection operating to remove weak links from the chain of cosmic evolution. The entity's callous dismissal of human suffering should have awakened Stanford to the true nature of his supposed partner, but by this point the researcher's dependence on Bill's knowledge and approval had become so complete that he could no longer distinguish between his own thoughts and the entity's manipulations. Stanford began to see Fiddleford's breakdown not as a tragedy, but as a necessary sacrifice in service of discoveries that would ultimately benefit all humanity. With Fiddleford's departure from the project, Stanford found himself alone with Bill in ways that accelerated his psychological deterioration, while simultaneously bringing the portal construction to its final phases. The entity's presence in Stanford's life became constant and overwhelming, manifesting not just through dreams, but in waking visions that blurred the boundaries between reality and hallucination. Stanford's laboratory became a realm where normal causality seemed suspended, where tools would move themselves according to Bill's will, and where complex calculations would appear on blackboards despite Stanford having no memory of writing them. The portal itself began to exhibit signs of autonomous activity, its components arranging themselves into configurations that seemed to anticipate completion, even as Stanford struggled to understand the principles governing their operation. The isolation that had once been Stanford's chosen condition now became a prison where Bill's influence could operate without external interference or challenge. The entity's psychological dominance became so complete that Stanford began to lose track of where his own personality ended and Bill's began, experiencing thoughts and desires that felt simultaneously familiar and alien. Bill's true nature became increasingly apparent as the portal neared completion, his communications losing all pretense of benevolence or partnership. The entity spoke with growing excitement about the chaos he would unleash once he gained permanent access to Stanford's dimension, describing plans that involved the complete subjugation of human consciousness and the transformation of Earth into a playground for interdimensional predators. Yet even these revelations proved insufficient to break Stanford free from Bill's psychological control. The researcher's identity had become so intertwined with the portal project that abandoning it felt like psychological suicide, the destruction of everything that had given his life meaning and purpose during the years since his arrival in Gravity Falls. It was only when Bill began to possess Stanford's body directly, using the researcher's physical form to advance the portal construction during periods when Stanford's consciousness was completely suppressed, that the full horror of his situation finally penetrated the layers of manipulation and self-deception that had protected him from recognizing the truth. Stanford's moments of lucidity became increasingly rare and precious, brief intervals when he could observe his situation with something approaching objectivity and recognize the magnitude of the disaster he had helped to create. During these periods, he understood that the portal represented not just a gateway between dimensions, but a weapon that could be used to destroy everything he had once claimed to value. The realization that he had become the instrument of an entity whose goals were fundamentally hostile to human civilization created a psychological crisis that shattered Stanford's remaining illusions about his partnership with Bill. The knowledge that his greatest scientific achievement would serve as the means for humanity's enslavement was more than his ego could bear, forcing him to confront the possibility that his entire adult life had been built on delusions of grandeur and intellectual superiority. Yet even as Stanford began to understand the true nature of his situation, Bill's psychological dominance remained strong enough to prevent him from taking effective action to stop the portal's completion. The entity's influence had become woven into Stanford's thought processes so thoroughly that any attempt to work against the project felt like fighting against his own mind, a form of psychological self-mutilation that his damaged psyche could barely contemplate. The final months before the portal's completion were marked by a desperate internal struggle between Stanford's remaining vestiges of moral clarity and Bill's overwhelming psychological control. The researcher began to develop elaborate plans for sabotaging his own work, schemes that were invariably discovered and countered by Bill's surveillance of his every thought and intention. Stanford's growing paranoia during this period was both symptom and survival mechanism, his mind's attempt to protect whatever remained of his authentic self from complete absorption into Bill's agenda. The elaborate security measures he began implementing around his laboratory were as much attempts to keep Bill out of his thoughts as they were efforts to prevent external interference with the portal project. The 3 journals that Stanford began writing during the winter of 1978 represented his final attempt to create a record of the truth that might survive his own destruction, hidden in code and scattered across multiple volumes to prevent Bill from discovering and suppressing them. The journals documented both the scientific principles underlying the portal's construction and the warnings that Stanford desperately hoped would prevent others from repeating his mistakes. As the portal approached completion, and Bill's excitement grew to levels that threatened Stanford's remaining sanity, the researcher made the most difficult decision of his life to reach out to the one person who might be able to help him. Despite the years of silence and resentment that had divided them since their childhood, the letter Stanford wrote to his twin brother Stanley in late 1978 was both plea for help and confession of failure, an admission that the intellectual pride that had driven him to Gravity Falls had ultimately led him to the brink of becoming humanity's destroyer rather than its savior. The letter that arrived at Stanley Pines' motel room in Columbia in late December of 1978 was the first communication he had received from his twin brother in more than 10 years, and its contents suggested that the brilliant Stanford he remembered from their childhood had either descended into madness or stumbled upon secrets that threatened everything he held dear. The hastily scrawled message spoke of betrayal and danger in terms so vague yet urgent that Stanley found himself booking passage back to the United States, despite having no clear understanding of what crisis awaited him. Stanley's journey back to Oregon was marked by the same mixture of resentment and concern that had characterized his feelings about Stanford since their bitter separation, following the science fair incident that had destroyed both their futures. The years since leaving home had taught Stanley that survival required adaptability rather than brilliance. street smarts rather than academic achievement, and the kind of practical cunning that could turn disadvantage into opportunity through sheer force of will. His arrival in Gravity Falls during the early hours of a February morning in 1979 revealed a town that seemed to exist in perpetual twilight, its streets empty, and its buildings shrouded in mist that carried undertones of something far more mysterious than ordinary weather patterns. The directions Stanford had provided led Stanley deep into forests that felt alive with watchful intelligence, along paths that seemed designed to discourage casual exploration by anyone lacking urgent business in their depths. Stanford's laboratory, when Stanley finally located it among the towering pines, was both exactly what he had expected from his brilliant brother and utterly unlike anything he could have imagined. The building's exterior suggested conventional research facility, but the electromagnetic distortions that surrounded it made Stanley's skin crawl with sensations that belonged to no normal scientific environment. The reunion between the twins was explosive in its immediate intensity and devastating in its revelation of how completely Stanford's personality had been altered by his years of isolation and obsessive research. The man who greeted Stanley at the laboratory door bore only superficial resemblance to the brother he remembered, his appearance ravaged by paranoia and sleeplessness, his brilliant mind fractured by exposure to forces that had pushed him far beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. Stanford's explanation of the crisis that had prompted his desperate summons was delivered in fragments and disconnected theories that painted a picture of scientific achievement corrupted into existential threat. He spoke of interdimensional entities and reality-threatening portals in terms that would have seemed like science fiction, fantasy, were it not for the tangible evidence of impossible technologies that filled his laboratory and the genuine terror that radiated from every gesture and expression. The portal itself dominated the laboratory's main chamber, like a technological cathedral dedicated to principles that human engineering had never been designed to accommodate. Its construction represented decades of work that had pushed the boundaries of materials, science, electromagnetic theory, and dimensional physics into territories that belonged more to advanced alien civilizations than to anything achievable through earthly research and development. Stanley's first glimpse of the completed portal was both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling. A machine that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time relationships, while simultaneously representing the pinnacle of human technological achievement. The device's very presence in the laboratory created distortions in local reality that made conventional physics seem like primitive superstition. Effects that Stanley could observe directly, despite lacking any scientific training that might have prepared him to understand their implications. Stanford's attempts to explain the portal's function and the dangers it represented were hampered by his deteriorated mental state and the complexity of concepts that had taken him years to fully comprehend. He spoke of entities that existed beyond the boundaries of normal dimensional space, beings whose goals were fundamentally incompatible with human survival, and whose access to Earth would represent the end of everything terrestrial civilization had ever achieved. The argument that erupted between the brothers was fueled by years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding, emotions that had festered in isolation until they exploded with devastating force at the worst possible moment. Stanley's practical mind struggled to accept theories that challenged every assumption about reality, while Stanford's desperate need for understanding and support clashed with his inability to communicate the true scope of the crisis in terms that someone without his specialized knowledge could fully grasp. The physical confrontation that followed was both inevitable and tragic. Two men whose childhood bond had been shattered by miscommunication and pride, now facing their greatest crisis, with the same inability to understand each other's perspectives that had driven them apart in the first place. Stanley's angry grab for the journal that contained Stanford's research notes triggered a struggle that sent both brothers stumbling toward the very device that represented humanity's greatest danger. Stanford's fall against the portal's activation switch was the kind of accident that transforms ordinary moments into turning points of historical significance, a split second of contact that set in motion events whose consequences would echo across 3 decades and ultimately determine the fate of everyone the brothers had ever known or loved. The portal's activation was both spectacular and terrifying, opening doorways between dimensions with a violence that shook the very foundations of local reality. The interdimensional rift that opened within the laboratory was unlike anything that had existed in Earth's atmosphere since the planet's formation, a wound in space-time that connected Stanford's familiar reality with realms that operated according to entirely different physical laws. Through this gateway poured energies and influences that belonged to dimensions where consciousness itself served as the fundamental building block of existence, where thoughts could reshape matter and intentions could rewrite the basic constants that governed natural phenomena. Stanford's passage through the portal was instantaneous and irreversible. His physical form translated into states of existence that bore no resemblance to anything that could survive in normal 3-dimensional space. One moment he was falling toward the machine he had spent years constructing. The next he had vanished completely, leaving behind only the fading echoes of energies that had briefly connected his laboratory with territories that human language lacked adequate words to describe. Stanley's reaction to his brother's disappearance was a mixture of horror, guilt, and desperate determination that crystallized into a resolution that would define the next 30 years of his life. The portal had closed itself after Stanford's passage, its massive energy requirements having drained the laboratory's power systems beyond their capacity to maintain the interdimensional connection. But the machine itself remained intact and potentially functional. The decision to assume Stanford's identity was born from equal parts practical necessity and emotional desperation, a strategy that would allow Stanley to remain in the laboratory while avoiding the legal complications that would inevitably follow if authorities discovered that the property's legal owner had vanished under circumstances that no conventional investigation could hope to explain or resolve. Stanley's transformation from wandering con artist to respectable researcher required skills he had developed through years of survival on society's margins, abilities that proved surprisingly applicable to maintaining the illusion that nothing fundamental had changed in Stanford's life or work. The same talent for deception that had allowed him to survive through petty fraud and creative misrepresentation now served to convince neighbors, government officials, and occasional visitors that the laboratory's owner continued to pursue his mysterious research projects with the same obsessive dedication that had always characterized his work. The early months of Stanley's masquerade were marked by desperate attempts to understand the portal's construction and operation well enough to reverse Stanford's fate, efforts that revealed both the extraordinary complexity of his brother's achievement and the staggering scope of knowledge that would be required to operate such a device safely. Stanley's practical intelligence, which had always focused on immediate survival rather than theoretical understanding, was forced to grapple with concepts that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality itself. The journals that Stanford had hidden throughout the laboratory served as Stanley's primary guides to the portal's function and the principles underlying its construction, but their contents were written in scientific terminology and theoretical frameworks that assumed levels of education Stanley had never possessed. His attempts to decode his brother's research became crash courses in advanced physics, mathematics, and interdimensional theory that pushed his naturally quick mind to its absolute limits. More challenging still was the need to maintain Stanford's public identity while simultaneously learning to operate technologies that required understanding of principles Stanford had spent years mastering. Stanley's impersonation had to be convincing enough to satisfy occasional visitors while avoiding the kind of detailed scientific discussions that would immediately reveal his lack of genuine expertise in the fields where Stanford had been recognized as a leading authority. The solution Stanley developed was to cultivate an image of increasing reclusiveness and eccentricity, characteristics that would explain any changes in behavior, while discouraging the kind of social interactions that might expose his deception. Stanford had already been known as something of a hermit, whose research kept him isolated from normal social activities, making it relatively easy for Stanley to exaggerate these tendencies, while claiming that his work had reached stages that required even greater privacy and concentration. The mystery shack that Stanley established as a cover for his portal research represented both practical necessity and psychological adaptation, a way of generating the income needed to fund his rescue efforts, while simultaneously creating the kind of deliberately ridiculous public facade that would discourage serious investigation into his activities. The tourist trap, filled with obvious fabrications and transparent hoaxes, served as perfect camouflage for someone whose real work involved technologies that would have been dismissed as impossible by anyone lacking direct experience with their effects. Stanley's natural talent for showmanship and his understanding of human psychology made him ideally suited for operating a business based on selling harmless deceptions to people who wanted to believe in mysteries without confronting genuinely dangerous truths. The Mystery Shack's exhibits of fake, supernatural phenomena provided cover for the real supernatural phenomena that filled the laboratory basement, while its atmosphere of commercial exploitation discouraged the kind of serious researchers who might have recognized the significance of the area's genuine anomalies. The years that followed were marked by a grinding routine of learning and experimentation, as Stanley struggled to master concepts that had required Stanford's genius-level intellect to originally develop, while simultaneously maintaining the illusion that nothing had changed in the laboratory's operations. Every breakthrough in understanding the portal's function was balanced by new discoveries about the complexity of interdimensional physics and the enormous risks involved in attempting to reopen connections between realities that operated according to incompatible physical laws. Stanley's isolation during this period was both self-imposed and necessary, as the dual demands of maintaining his masquerade and pursuing his rescue mission left little time or energy for normal human relationships. The few people who knew the laboratory's owner personally gradually drifted away as Stanford became increasingly unavailable for the social interactions that had never been numerous to begin with, while Stanley's own personality remained hidden beneath layers of deception that became more elaborate and more completely internalized with each passing year. The technical challenges Stanley faced in attempting to reactivate the portal safely were compounded by his lack of formal training in the sciences that governed the machine's operation. Where Stanford had approached the portal's construction through years of theoretical study and systematic experimentation, Stanley was forced to work backwards from a completed device whose principles he understood only partially, and whose safe operation required precision that left no margin for the kind of trial and error learning that had characterized most of his life experiences. The portal's energy requirements alone represented obstacles that pushed Stanley's resourcefulness to its limits, as the machine's operation required power levels that exceeded the capacity of conventional electrical systems by orders of magnitude that seemed to violate basic principles of energy conservation. Stanley's solutions involved jury-rigged power generation systems that combined legitimate electrical engineering with improvisational techniques that would have horrified any conventionally trained engineer, modifications that kept the portal functional while creating fire hazards, and safety violations that transformed the laboratory into a death trap disguised as a research facility. More dangerous still were the dimensional instabilities that began to manifest around the laboratory as Stanley's experimental reactivation attempts created brief connections with realities whose physical laws were incompatible with normal three-dimensional existence. These episodes filled the surrounding forest with temporal distortions, gravitational anomalies, and probability fluctuations that attracted the attention of creatures and entities whose presence in normal reality represented threats to the fundamental stability of local space-time. Stanley's encounters with these interdimensional intrusions provided crash courses in the practical aspects of anomalous phenomena, education that supplemented his theoretical studies with first-hand experience of the dangers that Stanford's research had been designed to explore and potentially control. The defensive measures Stanley was forced to develop ranged from conventional security systems to improvised devices that operated according to principles he understood only through direct observation of their effects on entities that existed partially outside normal dimensional space. The psychological toll of 30 years spent living under an assumed identity while pursuing a rescue mission that might prove impossible was immense, creating strains on Stanley's mental health that were compounded by the isolation and secrecy that his project demanded. The man who had once thrived on human contact and social interaction found himself cut off from meaningful relationships by the demands of maintaining a deception that had become so complete that he sometimes struggled to remember where. Stanford's identity ended, and his own began. Stanley's relationship with the town of Gravity Falls itself evolved from suspicious outsider to eccentric local fixture, as decades of residence gradually earned him a grudging acceptance from neighbors who found him strange but harmless. The Mystery Shack's success as a tourist attraction provided him with a legitimate reason for remaining in the area while generating the income needed to fund his ongoing research. Though the effort required to maintain his public persona while pursuing his private mission created additional layers of psychological strain that accumulated over the years like sediment in a pond. The portal's gradual deterioration over the decades created mounting pressure as Stanley realized that his window of opportunity for rescuing Stanford was slowly closing. The machine's exotic components degrading under stresses they had never been designed to withstand for extended periods. His increasingly desperate attempts to maintain and upgrade the portal's systems pushed his technical abilities to their limits while creating new safety hazards that transformed the laboratory into an environment where a single mistake could result not just in his own death but in the kind of interdimensional catastrophe that Stanford's original research had been intended to prevent. As the 30th anniversary of Stanford's disappearance approached, Stanley's work took on new urgency as he realized that the portal's deteriorating condition meant that his next reactivation attempt might be his last chance to bring his brother home. The preparations for this final effort required resources and expertise that pushed Stanley's abilities as both engineer and con artist to their absolute limits, setting the stage for events that would bring not just Stanford's return, but the arrival of complications that would test the entire Pines family in ways that 30 years of preparation could never have anticipated. The summer of 2012 would bring visitors to the Mystery Shack, whose presence would transform Stanley's solitary mission into a family crisis, as the arrival of his grandnephew and grandniece would force him to balance the demands of his portal project against responsibilities he had never expected to assume, while the approaching success of his rescue mission would unleash consequences that threatened everything he had worked 3 decades to protect. The summer of 2012 arrived in Gravity Falls with the kind of quiet anticipation that precedes momentous changes, though Stanley Pines had no way of knowing that the phone call from his estranged family would transform his solitary mission into something far more complex and dangerous than 30 years of portal research had prepared him to. Handel, the request to take custody of his grandnephew and grandniece for the summer months, came at the worst possible time, just as his calculations suggested that the portal's deteriorating systems were approaching the critical threshold where successful reactivation might finally be possible. Dipper and Mabel Pines stepped off the bus in Gravity Falls, carrying with them the kind of innocent curiosity and unguarded enthusiasm that Stanley had forgotten could exist in a world where every shadow might conceal interdimensional threats, and every moment of inattention could result in catastrophic exposure of secrets that had taken decades to protect. The twins were everything Stanley remembered being himself at their age, before life had taught him that survival required constant vigilance and that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. Dipper's appearance immediately marked him as the intellectual twin, his careful observation of their surroundings and systematic approach to understanding new environments, reminiscent of Stanford in ways that were both comforting and deeply unsettling. The boy's natural curiosity and analytical mind represented exactly the kind of qualities that could uncover the truth about the Mystery Shack's real purpose, while his obvious hunger for adventure and mystery made him potentially vulnerable to the same forces that had corrupted his great-uncle's research decades earlier. Mabel's irrepressible optimism and boundless energy provided a counterpoint to her brother's more serious nature, her genuine enthusiasm for the tackiest aspects of the Mystery Shack's tourist attractions, creating the perfect cover for Stanley's need to maintain the building's image as nothing more than a harmless roadside attraction. Her ability to find joy in the most obviously fabricated exhibits served as a reminder of what Stanley had lost during his years of isolation and deception, while her natural warmth began to crack through psychological barriers he had constructed to protect himself from the pain of human connection. The early days of the twins' residency at the Mystery Shack established patterns that would define their summer experience, while simultaneously creating new challenges for Stanley's carefully maintained double life. Dipper's investigative instincts and Mabel's talent for social interaction combined to create a dynamic that brought both energy and complications to a household that had operated according to rigid routines designed to minimize the risk of discovery. Stanley's introduction of the twins to Wendy Corduroy and Jesus Suze Ramirez represented his first genuine attempts at normal social interaction in decades, relationships that forced him to remember how to function as Grunkle Stan, rather than the isolated researcher he had become. Wendy's laid-back attitude and practical intelligence made her an ideal buffer between Stanley and the twins' more intensive curiosity, while Seuss's loyal nature and unquestioning acceptance of the Mystery Shack's eccentricities provided additional security for the secrets hidden in the basement. The delicate balance Stanley had maintained for 30 years began to shift almost immediately as Dipper's exploration of the Mystery Shack's grounds led him into areas where the portal's influence had created subtle but detectable anomalies in local reality. The boy's discovery of Journal 3 in the forest was both the fulfillment of Stanley's greatest fears and the beginning of events that would ultimately make his rescue mission possible, though the cost of success would prove higher than he had ever imagined. Stanford's journal represented everything Stanley had spent decades trying to prevent scientific documentation of Gravity Falls' supernatural phenomena that could lead curious minds down the same path of obsession and danger that had consumed his brother. Yet Dipper's possession of the journal also provided Stanley with his first reliable intelligence about the portal's effects on the surrounding environment, information that proved crucial for understanding how his reactivation attempts were influencing local space-time stability. Dipper's initial encounters with the journal's documented creatures began with the relatively harmless gnomes, whose territorial behavior around the forest had been one of Stanford's earliest observations. But the boy's natural courage and his desire to protect Mabel from supernatural threats quickly led him into confrontations with entities that posed genuine danger to anyone lacking proper preparation or protective equipment. The gnome encounter that marked Dipper's first real brush with Gravity Falls' hidden dangers also served as Stanley's introduction to his grandnephew's investigative abilities and his willingness to face unknown threats. In defense of his family, the boy's successful resolution of the gnome situation demonstrated both the courage that would make him a valuable ally and the recklessness that could lead him into the same trap of curiosity that had destroyed Stanford. Mabel's role in the gnome incident revealed her own hidden strengths, as her ability to see through superficial charm and her fierce loyalty to her brother proved crucial for escaping a situation that could have resulted in permanent separation from the human world. Her combination of trusting nature and protective instincts created a balance that complemented Dipper's analytical approach while providing emotional grounding that kept his investigations from becoming unhealthily obsessive. Stanley's response to learning about the twins' supernatural encounter was complicated by his need to maintain his public persona while simultaneously assessing the security implications of their exposure to genuine anomalous phenomena. His warnings about the dangers of exploring the forest were necessarily vague, as specific explanations would have required revealing knowledge that Stanford Pines, the researcher, might possess, but that Stan Pines, the tourist trap operator, should never have encountered. The pattern established by the gnome encounter Dipper discovering supernatural threats through journal research, the twins working together to overcome dangers, while Stanley remained unaware of the specific details, created a dynamic that allowed both Stanley's secret work and the twins' investigations to proceed without direct interference. Though the psychological strain of maintaining this separation grew more intense as the summer progressed. Dipper's growing obsession with the journal's mysteries paralleled Stanford's original descent into dangerous research in ways that Stanley found both familiar and terrifying. The boy's excitement at discovering each new anomaly, his systematic approach to cataloging supernatural phenomena, and his increasing willingness to take personal risks in pursuit of answers all echoed patterns that Stanley recognized from his brother's journal entries and personal observations during their brief reunion. The lake monster incident that followed the gnome encounter introduced the twins to Gravity Falls' aquatic anomalies, while simultaneously demonstrating how the town's supernatural ecosystem operated according to principles that challenged conventional understanding of predator-prey, relationships, and territorial behavior. The creature's intelligence and its complex relationship with local ecology suggested the kind of systemic interconnection between anomalous phenomena that Stanford's research had begun to map before his disappearance. Mabel's approach to the lake monster situation revealed her capacity for empathy that extended beyond normal human relationships to include beings whose existence operated according to entirely different biological and psychological principles. Her ability to recognize the creature's loneliness and her willingness to address its emotional needs rather than simply treating it as a threat represented a form of problem-solving that Stanley had never encountered in Stanford's more analytical approach to supernatural phenomena. The Wax Museum episode that brought the twins into contact with animated figures created through unknown processes provided their first encounter with entities that existed in the grey area between natural and artificial life. The wax figures' pseudo-consciousness and their ability to maintain complex behaviors despite lacking normal biological processes suggested principles of animation that challenged basic assumptions about the relationship between matter and awareness. Stanley's personal connection to the wax figures, particularly his complex relationship with his own wax duplicate, added emotional weight to an encounter that might otherwise have been dismissed as simply another supernatural oddity. The destruction and restoration of wax stands served as a metaphor for Stanley's own relationship with his assumed identity, while the figure's final fate raised questions about the nature of artificial consciousness that resonated with his own struggles to maintain a personality that was simultaneously genuine and completely fabricated. The Hand-Witch incident provided Dipper with his first direct experience of entities that operated according to principles of sympathetic magic, where physical objects could serve as conduits for supernatural influence across arbitrary distances. The witch's ability to manipulate Dipper's body through control of his severed hand introduced concepts of magical anatomy that existed outside conventional medical understanding, while demonstrating the kind of practical, supernatural threats that could affect anyone regardless of their level of preparation or knowledge. Mabel's role in resolving the Hand-Witch situation showcased her talent for creative problem-solving under pressure, her ability to think outside conventional frameworks when faced with supernatural challenges. Her approach to negotiating with the witch demonstrated social skills that proved applicable even to beings whose psychology operated according to non-human principles. Talents that would prove crucial for later encounters with entities whose motivations were even more alien and potentially dangerous. The convenience store incident that introduced the twins to the time manipulation capabilities hidden within mundane retail environments provided their first exposure to temporal anomalies and their first encounter with entities whose existence spanned multiple time streams simultaneously. The Time Baby's authority over temporal mechanics and its bureaucratic approach to timeline management suggested forms of supernatural organization that existed parallel to normal reality while maintaining limited interaction with conventional temporal flow. Dipper's experience with time travel and its paradoxes provided him with practical education about the dangers of attempting to manipulate natural forces that operated according to principles beyond normal human comprehension. His mistakes during the temporal manipulation episode served as warnings about the kinds of unintended consequences that could result from using supernatural abilities without adequate understanding of their systemic implications. The arcade incident that brought the twins into contact with digital entities that existed at the intersection of technology and supernatural phenomena provided their first encounter with beings that challenged conventional distinctions between artificial and natural intelligence. The video game character's ability to maintain coherent personalities while existing entirely within electronic media suggested principles of consciousness that operated independently of biological substrates. Mabel's victory over the arcade's supernatural challenges demonstrated her capacity for adapting to rapidly changing rules and environments, skills that proved applicable to situations where normal logic and conventional strategy were insufficient for achieving success. Her ability to maintain her core personality and values while navigating fundamentally alien environments represented the kind of psychological resilience that would prove essential for surviving more dangerous supernatural encounters. The puppet show incident provided both twins with their first exposure to entities that operated through possession and mental control, supernatural threats that targeted consciousness rather than physical well-being. The puppet master's ability to manipulate behavior through external influence introduced concepts of magical domination that operated according to principles beyond normal psychological manipulation. While the resolution of the incident demonstrated the importance of maintaining authentic identity, even under supernatural pressure, Stanley's growing awareness of the twins' supernatural encounters created increasing tension between his need to protect them from dangerous knowledge and his recognition that their natural curiosity and investigative abilities were leading them toward discoveries that could either complement or catastrophically interfere with his portal research. His attempts to discourage their interest in the town's anomalies were necessarily indirect, as direct warnings would have required explanations that could expose the much larger secrets he was working to protect. The relationship between Dipper and Wendy that developed during their various adventures provided both emotional grounding for the boys' increasingly intense research and potential vulnerability that supernatural entities could explore. Wendy's practical approach to unusual situations and her acceptance of the twins' occasional odd behavior created a buffer zone that helped normalize their experiences while providing additional security through her local knowledge and survival instincts. Seuss's role as inadvertent assistant and unconscious security system proved invaluable for maintaining the Mystery Shack's operations, while Stanley's attention was increasingly divided between his public responsibilities and his private research. The handyman's loyalty and his talent for creative problem-solving provided practical solutions to maintenance issues that might otherwise have exposed the building's unusual energy consumption and structural modifications. The summer's progression brought increasingly complex supernatural challenges that tested both twins' developing abilities while gradually revealing the systematic nature of Gravity Falls' anomalous ecosystem. Each incident provided new pieces of information about how supernatural phenomena interacted with normal reality, while simultaneously demonstrating that the town's strangeness operated according to underlying principles that could be studied, understood, and potentially predicted. Dipper's growing competence with supernatural threats was balanced by increasing awareness of how much he still didn't understand about the forces he was encountering. His success in resolving individual incidents was tempered by recognition that each victory revealed new questions and potential dangers, creating a cycle of investigation and discovery that paralleled Stanford's original research trajectory in ways that both impressed and concerned Stanley. Mabel's role as emotional anchor and creative problem solver became increasingly crucial as the supernatural encounters grew more complex and potentially dangerous. Her ability to maintain optimism and social connections while helping her brother navigate increasingly dark discoveries provided psychological stability that kept their investigations from becoming the kind of obsessive isolation that had consumed Stanford. The bond between the twins that strengthened throughout their various adventures created a support system that neither Stanford nor Stanley had possessed during their original encounters with Gravity Falls' supernatural forces. Their complementary abilities and mutual loyalty provided protection against the kind of isolation and paranoia that supernatural research could generate, while their shared experiences created understanding that no outside observer could provide. As summer progressed toward its climax, Stanley's portal research approached the critical threshold where successful reactivation might finally be possible, while the twins' investigations brought them closer to uncovering truths that could either support or catastrophically interfere with his rescue mission. The convergence of these parallel tracks of discovery created mounting tension that would ultimately force Stanley to choose between maintaining the secrecy that had protected his mission for 30 years and trusting his family with secrets that could endanger everything he had worked to achieve. The foundation had been laid for revelations that would transform the Mystery Shack from tourist trap to ground zero for an interdimensional crisis, while the relationships formed during the summer's adventures would provide the emotional and practical resources necessary for facing threats that exceeded anything the town had experienced since Stanford's original disappearance 30 years earlier. The discovery of the portal's existence came not through Dipper's systematic investigation or Mabel's intuitive leaps, but through the kind of accident that transforms carefully guarded secrets into family crises with the devastating efficiency of avalanches. Stanley's 30 years of meticulous deception unraveled in a single evening when mechanical failures in the portal's aging systems created electromagnetic disturbances that penetrated the Mystery Shack's upper floors with effects that no amount of creative explanation could dismiss as normal tourist trap malfunctions. The twins' initial discovery of the laboratory's existence was filtered through their summer-long education in Gravity Falls' supernatural phenomena, their minds already adapted to processing impossible realities through frameworks that combine scientific curiosity with acceptance of forces that operated beyond conventional understanding. Yet even their expanded conception of what might be possible was inadequate preparation for confronting technology that bridged dimensions and a family secret that stretched back 3 decades. Stanley's reaction to having his greatest secret exposed was complicated by emotions he had suppressed for so long that their sudden emergence felt like psychological earthquakes, reshaping the landscape of his carefully constructed identity. The relief of no longer maintaining the exhausting deception was balanced by terror that exposure would interfere with rescue efforts that were finally approaching success after decades of failure and disappointment. Dipper's response to learning about the portal combined the intellectual excitement of discovering technology that exceeded his wildest theoretical speculations with growing horror as he began to understand the implications of Stanley's decades-long masquerade. The boy's analytical mind immediately began connecting the portal's existence with various supernatural phenomena he had encountered throughout the summer, creating a framework for understanding Gravity Falls anomalies that was both more comprehensive and more terrifying than anything Journal 3 had prepared him to contemplate. Mabel's emotional reaction to the revelation was focused less on the portal's technological implications and more on the recognition that her beloved Grunkle Stan had been living a lie so complete and so prolonged that it called into question every interaction they had shared since their arrival. Her natural empathy allowed her to sense the pain that had driven Stanley to such elaborate deception, while her protective instincts made her fiercely determined to help him, regardless of the personal cost. The explanation Stanley provided about Stanford's disappearance and the rescue mission that had consumed 30 years of his life was necessarily incomplete, as the full truth about Bill's cipher and the interdimensional threats that had driven his brother to desperation would have required exposing the twins to knowledge that could endanger their psychological well-being in ways that Stanley was desperate to prevent. The portrait Stanley painted of Stanford was carefully edited to emphasize his brother's scientific brilliance while downplaying the obsessive isolation and dangerous partnerships that had ultimately led to his downfall. Stanley presented the portal's original construction as the result of legitimate research rather than manipulation by malevolent entities, a version of events that preserved Stanford's heroic image, while avoiding details that might inspire the twins to attempt their own contact with forces beyond normal dimensional boundaries. Dipper's questions about the portal's construction and operation revealed both his genuine desire to help and his dangerous tendency toward the same kind of obsessive curiosity that had originally doomed Stanford. The boy's immediate grasp of the portal's theoretical implications and his eagerness to assist with its operation demonstrated intellectual capabilities that reminded Stanley uncomfortably of his brother at the same age, before years of isolation and supernatural contact had warped his priorities and judgment. Mabel's focus on the emotional aspects of the situation provided crucial balance to Dipper's more technical approach. Her questions about Stanley's feelings and motivations during the 30 years of deception, creating opportunities for psychological healing that had been impossible during the decades of isolation. Her ability to see past the scientific complexities to recognize the fundamental story of one brother's dedication to saving another provided emotional grounding that kept the situation from becoming purely academic. The process of preparing for the portal's reactivation became a crash course in interdimensional physics and family dynamics, as Stanley found himself simultaneously educating the twins about technologies that operated according to principles beyond normal scientific understanding and processing emotions that had been suppressed for decades. The technical challenges of the portal's operation were complicated by the psychological complexity of working with family members whose presence transformed a solitary mission into a collaborative effort that required entirely different skills and considerations. Stanley's attempts to maintain control over the reactivation process were motivated by genuine concern for the twins' safety, combined with habitual secrecy that made it difficult for him to fully embrace the collaborative approach their assistance offered. His warnings about the portal's dangers were based on 30 years of first-hand experience with equipment that could malfunction in ways that threatened not just individual safety but the stability of local reality itself. The twins' gradual understanding of the portal's operation revealed both the elegance of Stanford's original design and the impressive scope of Stanley's modifications and maintenance efforts over 3 decades of largely self-taught engineering. Dipper's appreciation for the theoretical principles underlying the portal's function was matched by Mabel's recognition of the personal dedication that had kept the project alive, despite obstacles that would have defeated anyone with less determination or emotional investment. The final preparation phase for Stanford's rescue was marked by mounting tension as the portal's aging systems required increasingly complex workarounds to maintain stability, while electromagnetic readings suggested that dimensional barriers in the laboratory's vicinity were beginning to thin in ways that could attract unwanted attention from entities that existed in the spaces between realities. Stanley's growing anxiety about potential complications was balanced by excitement that had been building for 30 years, the prospect of finally succeeding in his rescue mission, creating emotional intensity that made it difficult to maintain the careful procedures that safe portal operation required. His desire to rush the process was tempered by recognition that mistakes at this stage could result not just in mission failure, but in catastrophic consequences that could endanger everyone he had come to care about. The moment of the portal's activation was both climactic achievement and beginning of entirely new complications, as the successful establishment of an interdimensional bridge was immediately followed by the realization that 30 years in alien dimensions had changed Stanford in ways that made his homecoming as challenging as his rescue had been. The figure who emerged from the portal bore only superficial resemblance to the brother Stanley remembered. His appearance and demeanor altered by experiences that belonged to no earthly frame of reference. Stanford's initial reaction to finding himself back in his familiar laboratory was complicated by 3 decades of survival in realities where trust was often fatal and paranoia was the only rational response to environmental conditions. His immediate assessment of the situation focused on potential threats and security concerns rather than emotional reunion. Professional habits developed through years of interdimensional survival, taking precedence over personal relationships that existed primarily as memories from a life he had been forced to abandon. The reunion between the brothers was marked by emotional complexity that reflected both the joy of successful rescue and the recognition that 30 years of separation had created gaps in understanding and experience that could not be bridged through simple affection or shared history. Stanley's image of the brother he had worked so hard to save was confronted with the reality of someone who had been fundamentally changed by experiences that existed outside normal human categories of understanding. Stanford's assessment of his family situation revealed both gratitude for Stanley's dedication and concern about the security implications of involving children in activities related to interdimensional research. His immediate focus on potential dangers and protective measures reflected survival instincts developed through decades of exposure to threats that operated according to principles beyond normal human experience, while his difficulty with emotional expression suggested psychological adaptations that had been necessary for surviving in realities where sentiment could be weaponized by predatory entities. The twins' reaction to meeting their mysterious great-uncle was filtered through their summer-long education in supernatural phenomena, their minds already prepared for encounters with beings whose existence challenged conventional assumptions about reality and behavior. Yet Stanford's combination of obvious intelligence, barely contained paranoia, and emotional distance created a psychological profile that was more complex and potentially troubling than the relatively straightforward supernatural creatures they had learned to understand and accommodate. Dipper's immediate fascination with Stanford's interdimensional experiences and his eager questions about technologies and realities beyond normal human access demonstrated both intellectual curiosity and the same dangerous tendency toward obsessive investigation that had originally led Stanford into his partnership with Bill Cipher. The boy's obvious intelligence and his hunger for advanced knowledge created a dynamic that Stanford recognized as potentially dangerous, given his own experiences with how such curiosity could be exploited by entities with their own agendas. Mabel's approach to Stanford was characterized by the same open-hearted acceptance that had allowed her to form positive relationships with various supernatural beings throughout the summer. Her natural empathy, extending to include family members whose experiences had taken them far outside normal human categories. Her ability to recognize emotional pain beneath defensive behaviors provided a foundation for connection that bypassed the intellectual complexities that made Stanford's other relationships challenging to navigate. Stanford's examination of Journal 3 revealed both pride in his past work and concern about how his documentation of Gravity Falls' supernatural phenomena had been used during his absence. His recognition that Dipper had successfully applied the journal's information to resolve various supernatural threats was balanced by awareness that such knowledge carried risks that a child might not fully appreciate, dangers that became exponentially greater when combined with the kind of advanced understanding that interdimensional experience could provide. The process of bringing Stanford up to date on 30 years of changes in both family dynamics and global events created opportunities for reconnection that were complicated by the psychological distance that interdimensional survival had required him to maintain. His difficulty with normal social interaction reflected adaptations that had been necessary for functioning in realities where emotional openness could provide hostile entities with psychological weapons, while his hypersensitivity to potential threats made it challenging for him to relax enough to enjoy the reunion he had dreamed about during decades of exile. Stanley's pride in the twins' supernatural problem-solving abilities was balanced by concern about exposing them to additional dangers, while Stanford's professional interest in their experiences was tempered by recognition that their encounters with Gravity Falls anomalies had already provided them with knowledge that could make them targets for entities that fed on human curiosity and ambition. The celebration of the successful rescue mission was overshadowed by Stanford's growing awareness that his return had created new security vulnerabilities, rather than resolving the interdimensional threats that had originally driven him into exile. His warnings about Bill Cipher and the ongoing dangers represented by entities that existed in the spaces between realities introduced concepts that challenged even the twins' expanded understanding of supernatural phenomena, while his insistence on implementing protective measures reflected recognition that his homecoming might have inadvertently attracted the attention of forces that viewed human consciousness as both resource and weapon. The convergence of Stanford's return, the twins' supernatural education, and the approaching end of summer created a dynamic that combined family reconciliation with mounting interdimensional crisis. The knowledge and experiences that each family member brought to the situation created both resources for dealing with supernatural threats and vulnerabilities that hostile entities could exploit, setting the stage for confrontations that would test not just their individual capabilities but their ability to function as a unified family unit under conditions that exceeded anything their previous experiences had prepared them to handle. The stage was set for revelations that would force each family member to confront aspects of themselves and their relationships that had been hidden beneath layers of deception, protection, and good intentions, while external forces gathered that would challenge not just their personal bonds, but their fundamental understanding of reality and their place within cosmic systems that operated according to principles beyond normal human comprehension. The apocalypse began with laughter that echoed from dimensions where sound itself served as a weapon against sanity. As Bill Cipher's escape from the mindscape into physical reality transformed the quiet town of Gravity Falls into ground zero for a catastrophe that threatened not merely human civilization, but the fundamental structure, three-dimensional existence itself. The entity's emergence into the material world was accompanied by reality distortions that spread outward from the town center like ripples in a pond, except these ripples carried with them the complete breakdown of natural laws that had governed earthly existence since the planet's formation. Stanford's warnings about Bill's capabilities proved inadequate preparation for witnessing the entity's power unleashed without the constraints that had previously limited his influence to dream visitations and brief manifestations in liminal spaces. The transformation of Gravity Falls into what Bill gleefully christened his Weirdmageddon represented the fulfillment of plans that had been developing since the portal's original construction. Schemes that had required Stanford's exile and 30 years of preparation to finally achieve fruition. The physical changes that swept through the town were both spectacular and horrifying, as familiar landscapes were twisted into configurations that belonged more to fever dreams than to any geography that had evolved through natural processes. Buildings grew legs and walked away from their foundations. The forest canopy turned into a carpet of eyes that watched everything with malevolent interest, and the sky itself became a canvas for Bill's artistic vision of reality as cosmic joke rather than stable framework for existence. The gravitational anomalies that had originally given the town its name became trivial curiosities compared to the fundamental alterations in physical law that Bill's presence imposed on local space-time. Objects fell in directions that corresponded to emotional states rather than planetary mass. Time flowed backwards, in areas where Bill found conventional causality boring, and the distinction between thought and physical matter became so blurred that strong emotions could spontaneously generate creatures that embodied psychological states as living entities. Bill's transformation of the town's human population into various forms of entertainment reflected both his complete lack of empathy for terrestrial life and his sophisticated understanding of how to use suffering as raw material. For cosmic art projects, citizens found themselves converted into living furniture, transformed into geometric shapes that retained their consciousness while losing all agency, or simply suspended in crystalline prisons where they could observe but not influence the destruction of everything they had ever known or loved. The entity's creation of a throne atop the town's water tower served as both symbol of his dominion and practical command center for coordinating the reality alterations that spread outward from Gravity Falls like infection through the dimensional fabric that separated realities. From this elevated position, Bill could observe the progress of his transformation while directing the activities of the interdimensional allies he summoned to assist in converting Earth into a realm more suitable for beings whose existence transcended normal spatial and temporal constraints. The creatures that Bill brought through the dimensional barriers to serve as his army represented forms of life that had evolved in realities where the concepts of matter, energy, and consciousness operated according to entirely different principles. These entities viewed the destruction of human civilization not as tragedy but as redecorating, the replacement of boring three-dimensional existence with more interesting configurations that allowed for greater creative expression and more stimulating forms of entertainment. Stanford's immediate response to the crisis combined professional assessment of the interdimensional threat with personal guilt over his role in creating the conditions that had made Bill's escape possible. His years of experience with hostile entities from parallel dimensions provided tactical knowledge that proved crucial for understanding the enemy's capabilities, while his intimate familiarity with Bill's psychology offered insights into potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by resistance forces. The family's initial attempts to coordinate an effective response to the crisis were complicated by the need to protect Dipper and Mabel from direct exposure to Bill's influence, while simultaneously utilizing their unique experiences with Gravity Falls supernatural phenomena as resources for understanding and potentially countering the entity's reality manipulation abilities. Stanford's protective instincts toward his grandnephew and grandniece conflicted with recognition that their summer-long education in anomalous phenomena had prepared them for this crisis in ways that conventional adult authorities could never match. Stanley's reaction to the apocalyptic situation was characteristically practical, focusing on immediate survival needs and tactical considerations, rather than the cosmic implications of interdimensional warfare. His decades of experience with deception and improvisation provided valuable skills for operating in an environment where conventional rules no longer applied, while his deep emotional investment in protecting his family created motivation that transcended normal human limitations when circumstances required extraordinary measures. The formation of the resistance movement occurred organically, as various groups of survivors realized that isolated defensive actions were insufficient for countering threats that operated on the scale of reality itself. The coalition that eventually assembled around the Pines family represented an unlikely alliance of government agents, supernatural creatures, reformed criminals, and ordinary citizens, whose only common ground was recognition that Bill's version of reality was incompatible with any form of existence they were prepared to accept. Dipper's role in the resistance was complicated by his detailed knowledge of supernatural threats combined with his obvious vulnerability to psychological manipulation by entities that specialized in exploiting human curiosity, ambition. His familiarity with Journal 3's documentation of local anomalies provided tactical intelligence about creatures and phenomena that could be turned against Bill's forces, while his analytical mind proved crucial for developing strategies that could function in environments where normal logic had been suspended or reversed. Mabel's contribution to the resistance effort was less obviously tactical but equally important, as her ability to maintain emotional stability and social connections under extreme stress provided the psychological foundation that kept the group functioning as a coordinated unit rather than fragmenting into competing factions. Her natural optimism and her talent for creative problem-solving proved essential for maintaining morale during periods when conventional assessment suggested that defeat was inevitable. The discovery of the Zodiac Wheel and its potential for channeling sufficient unified intention to challenge Bill's reality manipulation represented both hope for victory and the ultimate test of the relationships that had been built and strained throughout the summer's adventures. The wheel's requirement for perfect cooperation between individuals whose personalities and priorities had often conflicted created a challenge that was simultaneously simple in concept and extraordinarily difficult in execution. Stanford's explanation of the Zodiac's theoretical basis provided the resistance with understanding of how concentrated human consciousness could serve as a stabilizing force against reality distortions that operated through imposing alien forms of order on terrestrial existence. The ritual's success would require not just cooperation but genuine unity of purpose, a level of psychological integration that transcended individual differences and personal conflicts in service of collective survival. The gathering of the Zodiac participants brought together individuals whose relationships had been marked by conflict, misunderstanding, and competing loyalties, creating a situation where the success of humanity's last hope depended on resolving interpersonal issues that had developed over decades of complicated history. Each participant brought both essential qualities and personal baggage that could either contribute to the ritual's power or undermine its effectiveness through unresolved emotional conflicts. The failure of the Zodiac ritual was both inevitable and tragic, as the psychological unity required for its success proved impossible to achieve among individuals whose relationships had been built on foundations of deception, resentment, and misunderstood motivations. The collapse of the attempt represented not just tactical defeat, but the recognition that human nature itself might be incompatible with the kind of collective action required for survival under cosmic-level threats. Bill's response to the failed Zodiac attempt was to escalate his reality manipulation to levels that threatened not just the local area but the stability of dimensional boundaries throughout the cosmic neighborhood, creating a crisis that would eventually attract the attention of interdimensional authorities whose intervention could result in Earth's complete isolation from the broader multiverse rather than restoration of normal conditions. The realization that conventional resistance strategies were inadequate for dealing with Bill's escalated threat level forced the surviving family members to consider options that required personal sacrifices on scales that challenged every assumption about what individuals could be expected to endure in service of collective survival. The solutions that remained available demanded not just courage, but the willingness to surrender aspects of identity and memory that defined personal existence itself. Stanley's recognition that he possessed unique vulnerability to Bill's influence, combined with capabilities that could potentially be turned against the entity, created the foundation for a strategy that was both tactically brilliant and personally devastating. His decades of experience with identity manipulation and his established pattern of sacrifice for family welfare prepared him for actions that would require surrendering the very sense of self that had sustained him through 30 years of isolation and deception. The memory gun that had originally been developed as a tool for protecting innocent civilians from traumatic supernatural encounters became the instrument through which victory could be achieved, though its use required accepting consequences that transformed triumph into tragedy. The device's ability to selectively remove memories offered the possibility of trapping Bill within a mind that could be deliberately emptied of the knowledge and experiences that the entity required for maintaining his reality. Manipulation abilities. Stanley's decision to serve as the trap for Bill's consciousness was made with full understanding of what the victory would cost. Recognition that success would require sacrificing not just his life, but his identity, his memories, and his relationships with everyone he had learned to love. His willingness to pay this ultimate price reflected both his deep commitment to protecting his family and his acceptance that some battles could only be won through losses that transformed the nature of victory itself. The final confrontation between Bill and the Pines family took place on psychological battlefields that existed within the landscape of human consciousness, where the entity's cosmic power was balanced by the accumulated strength of relationships that had been tested and refined through shared struggle against impossible odds. The battle's outcome depended less on superior firepower than on the ability of human connection to provide stability in environments where reality itself had become fluid and negotiable. Stanley's successful deception of Bill during the final moments of the conflict represented the culmination of skills developed through decades of survival, through wit and improvisation. Abilities that proved decisive against an opponent whose overconfidence in his own cosmic superiority had blinded him to the possibility that mere humans might possess resources that transcended normal dimensional categories. The victory was achieved not through superior power, but through superior understanding of what ultimately mattered when everything else had been stripped away. The destruction of Bill's cipher and the restoration of normal reality came at the cost that Stanley had understood and accepted from the moment he chose to serve as the trap for the entity's consciousness. His successful sacrifice eliminated not just the immediate threat, but removed from existence one of the most dangerous interdimensional predators that had ever emerged from the spaces between realities, though the price paid for this victory left wounds that would require generations to fully heal. The aftermath of Weirdmageddon revealed a world that had been restored to normal function, but forever changed by the knowledge that reality itself was far more fragile and far more dependent on human consciousness than anyone had previously understood. The experience had demonstrated both the incredible vulnerability of three-dimensional existence to forces that operated outside normal space-time constraints, and the extraordinary power that human relationships could wield when focused through unity of purpose and genuine mutual commitment. The autumn mist began to settle among the Oregon pines like memories finding their proper places after a summer that had challenged every assumption about what was possible in a world that had seemed so ordinary just months before. The leaves turned their traditional colors of gold and crimson, but now each transformation carried whispers of magic that would never again be dismissed as mere seasonal chemistry by those who had witnessed reality itself bend and reshape according to forces that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of normal human experience. Dipper and Mabel stood at the bus station where their extraordinary summer had begun, their suitcases packed with souvenirs that included both conventional tourist mementos and carefully hidden artifacts whose true significance could never be fully explained. To parents who had sent their children away for a simple vacation in a sleepy logging town, the journal that had opened doorways to understanding was safely tucked among Dipper's belongings, its pages containing knowledge that would influence the rest of his life in ways that no conventional education could ever match. The twins' departure was complicated by the recognition that they were leaving behind not just geographical locations but relationships and experiences that had fundamentally altered their understanding of themselves and their place in a universe far stranger and more wonderful than they had ever imagined. The bond they had forged with Stanley had deepened through shared trials that had tested the very foundations of reality, while their brief encounter with Stanford had provided glimpses of possibilities that stretched far beyond the horizons of any normal childhood dreams. Stanley's farewell to his grandnephew and grandniece was marked by emotions that he struggled to express after decades of protecting himself from the vulnerability that comes with genuine human connection. The summer had taught him that family was not just genetic accident, but chosen commitment, that the relationships worth preserving were those that could survive the revelation of even the most carefully guarded secrets and still find reasons for love and loyalty that transcended individual flaws and failures. The restoration of Stanley's memories through the patient work of family members who had learned to value him for who he had become, rather than mourning, who he had been, created a foundation for healing that extended far beyond the immediate crisis of identity loss. The process had revealed that memory was not just individual storage of personal experience, but collective creation of shared meaning. stories that gained power and significance through being told and retold among people who understood their true importance. Stanford's gradual adjustment to a world that had continued evolving during his 30 years of exile was complicated by his need to process not just technological and social changes, but the recognition that his family had grown and changed in ways that made his homecoming both joyful reunion and introduction to people he was only beginning to know. His relationship with Stanley had been transformed by understanding the scope of sacrifice his brother had made, while his connection to the twins represented an entirely new category of family bond that would require time and patience to fully develop. The Mystery Shack continued to operate as a tourist attraction, but its exhibits now served a dual purpose of entertaining visitors, while simultaneously providing cover for more serious research into phenomena that required careful study and protective secrecy. The balance between commercial success and scientific investigation created a framework for ongoing exploration that could satisfy both Stanley's practical needs and Stanford's intellectual curiosity, while maintaining the security that their experiences with Bill Cipher had demonstrated was essential for preventing future catastrophes. Wendy and Suze remained integral parts of the extended Mystery Shack family, their loyalty and practical skills providing continuity that helped bridge the gap between the summer's extraordinary events and the more mundane challenges of operating a business in a town where supernatural phenomena were natural parts of the local ecosystem. Their acceptance of the family's secrets created a foundation for community that extended beyond blood relationships to include chosen connections that had been tested under conditions that revealed true character and commitment. The town of Gravity Falls itself had been forever changed by its experience as ground zero for interdimensional warfare, its citizens now possessing collective knowledge about the fragility of reality and the importance of maintaining vigilance against forces that could emerge from the spaces between dimensions without warning or conventional preparation. The shared trauma had created bonds of community that transcended previous divisions, while simultaneously imposing responsibilities for secrecy that would influence local culture for generations to come. The journals that documented the town's supernatural phenomena would continue to serve as resources for future researchers who might need to understand and respond to anomalies that operated according to principles beyond normal scientific frameworks. These texts represented not just scientific documentation, but warnings from those who had survived encounters with forces that viewed human civilization as temporary curiosity rather than permanent feature of cosmic landscape. Reminders that knowledge always came with responsibilities that extended far beyond individual satisfaction or achievement. The cycles of mystery and discovery that had characterized Gravity Falls since its founding would continue, but now under the protection of guardians who understood both the wonder and the danger that came with living at the intersection of multiple realities. The balance between exploration and safety would require constant negotiation, as each generation would face choices about how much truth to reveal and how much secrecy to maintain in service of protecting both individual curiosity and collective survival. Summer's end brought not conclusions but transitions, the recognition that extraordinary experiences become part of ordinary life through the simple process of integration and acceptance. The magic that had seemed so foreign and threatening had become familiar, while the family bonds that had been tested by cosmic forces had emerged stronger and more flexible than anyone could have anticipated. The twins would carry these lessons back to California, where their expanded understanding of reality would influence everything they encountered, while the Mystery Shack would continue its dual mission of education and protection Under the guidance of brothers who had learned that the most powerful forces in any universe were those that connected conscious beings through relationships that transcended individual limitations and fears. Rest now, knowing that mystery and magic are always closer than we think, waiting for those brave enough to seek them out. The forest keeps its secrets, the family keeps its bonds, and somewhere in the distance between sleeping and waking, the next adventure waits to unfold in the endless cycle of discovery that defines both individual growth and collective evolution. Close your eyes and let the mist carry you toward dreams where impossible things happen every day and love proves stronger than any darkness the worlds can conjure.